Welcome to RCast, the official podcast of the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. Beyond our platform, our investment partners, Reflective Ventures and Pythia, fund organizations that are working within our core mission statement to create a better world by enabling social coordination in robust, secure, and scalable ways. I'm Derek Barris, the Director of Content for RChain. Each week on RCast, I'll be talking with the founders of our portfolio companies, as well as co-op members, staff, and other figures in the RChain ecosystem about the most pressing issues in blockchain today. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about the platform, our community, our validator sale, and information on becoming a member. By now you've read about last week's UN climate change report that said a 1.5 degrees Celsius raise could warm our planet by 2030, triggering a series of catastrophic events. Or maybe you haven't. Maybe you scrolled past it and thought the headline was sufficient enough. That's the thing about climate change. We see it as sometime off in the future, or something that won't be that bad, a bit more rain and less beach. People in colder regions joke that they'll finally get to live in Los Angeles. Well, I do live in Los Angeles, and in the coming decades that might not be possible. My apartment is roughly 4 miles from the Pacific, but even that distance might not be enough. Cities like Miami and New York are even in more danger. Unfortunately, humans are mostly reactive animals. Being proactive is not our forte. Here's the thing, though. You can't say we haven't been warned. Fortunately, some people are taking it seriously. Evan Karan is the co-founder and managing director of Swytch, a new blockchain-based solution for tracking carbon emissions that is part of Reflective Ventures' portfolio. By tokenizing emissions, Swytch is incentivizing cities and companies to invest in infrastructure development that will reduce the impact of our energy sources. Individuals can partake in this as well, by investing in better home energy resources and electric vehicles. This is one of the most exciting uses of blockchain I've come across, and it's also direly important. Over my decades of journalism, I've interviewed thousands of people. Each interview is always different. Sometimes I ask a question and the subject speaks for a half an hour. The harder interviews are when each question receives only a single sentence in reply. But I'm a fan of the Bill Moyers approach to journalism. In my career, I have the luxury of being educated in public. That's what I thought of most talking with Evan. He delivers meaning with every word, and this is an ear-opening conversation you have ahead. Make sure to check out Swytch at swytch.io, SWYTCH.io, and follow them on social media to see what they're up to. And while you're on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and all of those, follow RChain as well. I'll see you there. And now, my conversation with Evan Karan. When did you first see climate change as a serious threat?
So my background was in energy trading, and so I started my career post-Enron in 2003. And I think I was probably one of the earliest people to be like, oh, it's not real. It's not, kind of questioning the data. And I think that I started, I stopped believing the deniers, and I started believing the actual science and doing my own research instead of just, looking at what was on the front cover of certain newspapers or certain posts, political commentary about climate change. And I started looking at the raw numbers, started looking at climate migration, bleaching of corals, started looking at wild weather conditions. And, I'm part of the American Meteorological Society. I'm part of their Energy Council. And what's interesting is you have a split kind of scientific community that just sees climate change as just, part of the normal, natural, long-term cycle of weather. But when, when the numbers keep telling you something, it's like almost like the thing where people say, follow the money. the numbers keep saying that the weather is getting more extreme. We're getting once in a century events happening every year. That's kind of when I knew things were changing significantly. And then when I realized that 97% of the scientific community is in consensus around climate change, the answer rapidly changed in my mind. So I think I'm probably somewhere between 7 and 10 years into my research, my own research on climate change specifically, and the greenhouse gas emissions specifically from climate change. There's a lot of things around climate change. There's oceans, there's forestry, there's all different types of contributors to climate change. But my main focus has been on greenhouse gas emissions.
Explain to me what an energy trader on Wall Street does.
So that's a great question. So I think Enron, so this guy Mark Rich was kind of the grandfather of kind of the commodities markets. He was, I think, credited with kind of creating one of the first, publicly traded or standardized traded oil contracts. And since then, in the early 2000s, post Enron, Wall Street kind of got involved in energy trading. So instead of just being a bank that lent money to projects to finance construction of power plants or credit for power plants, it actually started getting it more involved in risk taking about buying and selling energy contracts on either Chicago exchange or basically the Chicago Board of Trade or the NYBOT or the NYMEX. These are exchanges that were created to basically facilitate the standardization and transfer of risk from one counterparty to another with an underlying commodity. And so energy was just, basically modeled very similarly to other commodity markets because it could be, they could be a standard unit of exchange. There can be regional differences and quality of energy assets. Basically the Wall Street traders got in and they saw a place where they could buy power or buy energy for a low price and sell it for a high price, or subsequently short energy stocks or short energy commodities, and then, basically borrow and then buy back at a lower price. And so that's been happening, for decades on Wall Street, and the energy trading market was very robust post Enron in the early 2000s.
Did you go from there to starting Swytch?
Yeah, I would say I was an energy trader for many years, basically doing energy arbitrage in the very complex electricity markets in North America. And then I recognized that there was a lot more to do in energy, from a kind of feeling a bit more entrepreneurial than someone who just, basically clicked screens and bought and sold. I wanted to understand the financial markets around energy. I wanted to understand the credit markets around energy. I wanted to understand the entire energy vertical, not just trading or marketing, but how power plants, were constructed, how renewable energy plants, receive their subsidies from the government, and how downstream energy solutions, like when you turn your light on, the billing for, all the way down to the retail side. And so I transitioned from Wall Street, from an investment bank like Deutsche Bank, to an energy merchant, and then I went from an energy merchant to a private equity group. From there, I spent 4 years in private equity, kind of doing both trading, origination, structured finance, and a little bit of M&A. And then I would say about a year and a half ago, or almost 2 years ago now, the opportunity started to look better in energy technology. And I spent about 6 months trying to research and actually researching the best kind of emerging technology plays. And, that goes from microgrids to demand response to energy, electric charging stations to EVs to, you name it, renewables, wind, solar, hydro, micro hydro. And what I landed on after my research was what kind of binds all of them together. And from our perspective, it looked like data was kind of the number one, because I wasn't going to get into hardware and I wasn't going to patent, a new form of solar panels. And then that very quickly led to kind of a new emerging ecosystems and new emerging systems around data and data exchange and data transfer. And that opened up the doors for blockchain, and that opened up the doors for creating Swytch.
What is it about blockchain that you feel is uniquely qualified to address this problem?
I think when you look at the energy markets in general, the information is fairly siloed and controlled by very few counterparties. I think that there's a incredible amount of inefficiencies associated with basically warehousing information in places that don't talk to each other. I think that there is a significant amount of need for trusted information, and I think that blockchain represents a very good opportunity for that. And I think when you talk about transactions in general, the transactions that are going to exist between basically different IoT devices and different devices in general is going to require a system that is not necessarily controlled by one counterparty, that can be basically that is required to kind of be decentralized and required to basically have a significant amount of scale and also be inexpensive to transact. And so that's kind of what led me into the direction of blockchain specifically. And obviously there's a number of other considerations of why blockchain is important around data security, data privacy, that's really, that's a bunch of them. I mean, there's tons more, but that's kind of what led us into that. And I think when you look at blockchain specifically with the energy markets around securing information, as I mentioned before, but also at the same time creating digital assets associated with energy events that can be tracked, recorded, traced, have a public record, an auditable record. All that is very important if we're going to be able to basically generate kind of the next version of the best energy grids the best and most efficient energy grids that we can find.
I remember a few years ago, the New Yorker did an expose on public utilities, and obviously we're all energy consumers, but personally, I treat climate change as a serious problem. There are minor steps that I take, obviously, that can be influential. I've read an argument that until governments step in and really enforce regulations, no matter what you do on a personal level, isn't going to have big enough impact. But say I'm someone who I don't have an electric car. My wife had an early generation Leaf that didn't work out so well, but I've heard they've gotten better.
Yes.
But say I'm someone who is interested in these things and I want to do better. So what does Swytch and its rewards program, the tokenization of it, what does that do for me? How do I interact with that?
So yeah, it's a great question. I think that's what's frustrating to a lot of people around, people who understand that their impact from the environmental perspective, one person's impact, or one person's change in behavior doesn't necessarily make a huge impact. But it's the same thing with kind of voting. One person's vote, they say every vote matters, right? But 1 million votes matter, and 50 million votes matter. And so, again, there are some challenges associated with kind of shutting your lights off and just doing things because it's the right thing to do. And it has to be done with a large network of people, right? It can't just be one person. It has to be hundreds of thousands of millions of people with collective action. And so when we talk about Swytch, we talk about figuring out, and the whole kind of background around Swytch was how do you create the right types of incentives to be able to reward pro-social behavior? And how do you create a game that is cooperative, right? How do you create cooperative games? Cooperative games are very challenging to create because in game theory, you have competitive games and you have winner take all and you have, tit for tat, and you have all these different strategies around game theory. But the whole approach that we try to take is basically treating the energy world as a commons. And what I mean by a commons is treating the commodity specifically, or the energy that's being produced, as a finite resource rather than an infinite resource. And when we do that and we treat it as a finite resource that has costs, economic costs that sit outside of the commodity itself, or the actual asset itself, which is the externalities of carbon, things get very interesting from there. And so the idea behind Swytch is to basically take your behavior, your action, right, the collective action of not just you, but your entire community, and kind of weave that together and value basically with a apples to apples comparison of your behavior and your actions versus everyone else's, versus the networks. And then basically generate a reward for that. And there's levels of complexity associated with how we generate the reward, what dynamic adaptive control is, what finding evolutionary stable strategies are for certain communities around certain objective functions. There's lots of complexity associated with that, but when you boil it down to very simply, we want to create a global carbon ledger that has debits and credits, And when you reduce carbon, you get paid, you get something for it. And when you consume carbon, you kind of, you're on the other side, right? Sorry, when you produce carbon, you're being charged for it, right? And in our world, we don't have time to wait for government action to be able to design the right programs and marketplaces so that there is a effective carbon tax or carbon charge on every good and service that exists in the world. We've waited too long. The Paris Climate Accord and some of the other protocols that have been created through government action have been, cooperative in design, but also non-compulsory, right? That you don't have to do it, right? And very hard to track and very hard to compare. And so you're not really sure what your neighbor's doing. And so kind of you're in the same boat. You're kind of like, well, I'm not going to do it either, or maybe I'm not going to try as hard. And so I think from our perspective is that we felt like there was an opportunity to create a new system that if we had the level of scale and the level of attention and awareness that we can get, not only the people involved, but basically coordinate around these bottom-up self-organizing communities around cities and tribes. And that's kind of what our approach has been. And yes, it sounds like kind of boiling the oceans, but the goal is to kind of start with energy companies that have an understanding of their impact, specifically ones that build renewable energy resources, and basically focus on basically creating a better system for them, with the intended consequence of generating a new form of what I would call valuation for energy activities, if that makes sense.
Sure. So would you say your target customer is the consumer like myself? Is it cities? Is it corporations? Is it all of them? Or are you focusing on specific organizations or groups?
Yeah, I think we're set up as a nonprofit, private nonprofit foundation, and so we also view this as a business problem and a business issue. So creating a B2C consumer product for the end user to get max adoption would take we believe would take a very long time and a lot of money. And so our approach is kind of business to city. We call it B2C, but it's business to city. And also business to business. And so our approach has been partnering with academic institutions to prove and create reputation in the work that we're doing, to partner with cities that have a desire to be more sustainable and more renewable and really understand the levels of renewable and sustainable targets and make sure that they're achievable, and then work with corporates, including industrials that generate energy and also generate energy from fossil fuels, as well as multinational companies that either have a mandate for an ESG or an ESG programs or sustainable investment strategies. So that's kind of where we've been playing. So I think from a consumer perspective, we would love to be able to get a viral consumer base that's using the token and interacting with the products. And I think we're going to get there. But for kind of our biggest bang for our buck, and from a marketing perspective, is we are working on partnerships, working with American Renewable Energy Institute, which is a large nonprofit NGO here in the U.S., working with MIT, the City Sciences Lab, with basically coordinating our activities there, and then working with other cities really outside the U.S. that are really kind of focused on how they can be more sustainable, how they can track their sustainability efforts. And then how could they can actually reward the right types of efforts and the right types of assets so that we get more of those rather than less.
Right. And you talk about working with MIT and organizations, and there's so much talk about the sort of power struggle going on between government and corporations and local governments and federal government. And there's all these different struggles. But how do you feel when you watch an administration championing coal, for example?
I think that gives us more fuel for the fire. I think if you look at the C40, which is the largest cities in the world, the Global Conference of Mayors, there's a global conference of mayors. There's a coalition of mayors against coal. There's a lot of organizations, and there's one other one that I can't remember off the top of my head. I think they are. They represents about 3,000 cities. It's the National League of Cities that have all committed to reducing their impact on the climate, which includes sustainable water practices, forestry management, basically supporting renewables, supporting and figuring out solutions from a technology perspective to get more renewables on the grid without basically blowing the grid up or burning the grid down from a engineering perspective. So I think from a nation state policy perspective, having the administration say, you know what, we don't believe in climate change. We don't believe in, let's support coal. Let's support fossil fuel generation. I think, the cities are the cities and the communities are desperate for solutions. And I think if you can make the math work, the renewables make sense, right? I think that there are, if you can tell me that it's, I don't think anyone can agree that particulate matter, smog, mercury, nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide is good for anybody, right? Look at LA, for instance. I mean, LA's done a lot of work. Look at the smog. The smog's all from cars, right? Look at cities in China. Look at cities in the global south. I mean, you can't even see in front of your face. Pollution is bad. Air pollution is really bad. And we can fix that problem. And we have technology today. We didn't have it 20 years ago. We didn't have it 30 years ago. We didn't have it 50 years ago. And we really barely had it 10 years ago. But we actually have technology today that can get us to a cleaner, safer, more resilient energy world. So why not do it, right? And the world has poured billions of dollars and potentially even trillions of dollars into the energy mix and increasing renewables, but it has not outpaced the growth in underlying demand. Obviously, as we become a more connected world, our energy usage becomes even higher, right? We have an insatiable appetite for electricity. We have the urbanization of a fair portion of the rural world, right, in India and China and parts of Africa, where they're moving to cities and their energy consumption is exploding per person. And we are barely keeping pace with the growth in energy, and energy growth is set to double before 2040. We only have 5% of the world has with renewables. That's not going to cut it, right? We need significant investment in renewable energy resources in order to basically get on the other side and forget about the carbon that we need to get out of the atmosphere just to reduce the carbon to pre-industrial revolution levels. And it's hard. It's going to be very hard for us to do. But if we don't take care of the problem now, the problem will become much worse and basically be kind of this unstoppable situation in 20 years. So, the whole point of what we work on, what we wake up every day to do is to accelerate the adoption of the technology. It's already available. It's already there. It's like cloud computing 15, 20 years ago, right? It was there. It didn't work so great. Maybe people didn't fully trust it, but now it's kind of like a de facto standard. So we want to do that for both blockchain, number one, and renewable technologies, number two. And so to the extent that we support the displacement of fossil fuels in energy markets, we are going to focus all of our efforts on that. And there's going to be plenty of other projects that focus on forestry and fisheries and wildlife management and water management and traffic management and electric vehicles and transportation. We're going to focus on the ones that we have that we can see. We can focus on the ones where we have a very good data set to start with. We kind of know where all the energy power plants are in the world. There's not secret coal plants in the middle of nowhere, not connected to anything. So we have a fairly good starting point to be able to identify what assets are going to be the ones that are contributing the most to the carbon table, I guess the carbon ledger, and focus on the ones that are helping reduce those. And so to the extent that you are in a marketplace that has a lot of fossil fuel generation as its fuel mix, the assets that get invested and installed there should have the biggest impact on the world, right? You're displacing the most in that area. So that's been our entire approach. And again, I think just to come full circle on your question, when administrations come out in denial / support for the alternative story, it's not a political conversation. It's either you believe facts or you do not believe facts. And if you do not believe facts, then you are on the wrong side of history in this one. But it kind of fuels our fire. And I think if you look at corporate America, especially some companies that might have some morality issues in Silicon Valley, a lot of them have come out in the extreme support for renewable and sustainable energy technologies, which I think is very hard to argue against.
Absolutely. What tech in this sector are you most excited about?
In energy specifically, I mean, I think that we're looking at being able to install, I think one of the major problems, again, let me back up. One of the major problems with solar is that you need to be able, the major concerns with solar from a utility perspective is, well, what happens when the sun doesn't shine? Or what happens at night when you still need to turn your air conditioner on and plug your iPhone in and plug your electric vehicle in? And I think that the most exciting thing to me is energy storage, followed up by increased capacity for solar, right? So more efficient solar farms, and then followed up by demand response. That's kind of like my triad, my tripod of technologies that I feel like can actually change. And it's not nothing new, right? We're not talking about nuclear fusion, or we're not talking about salt thorium. We're not talking about pneumatic power or anything like wave power or any other, pseudoscience experiments, or even clean coal. We're talking about three technologies that already exist today that need basically a scale to be able to get it functioning in the way that it could, right? To maximize the capacity of those technologies. So what I mean by storage is batteries, distributed battery solutions all over, right, in all grids. When I talk about more efficient solar panels, is panels that absorb more, basically create more electricity per unit of surface area. And when I say demand response, is coordinated artificial intelligence and machine learning for when to shut your lights off, when to shut your AC off, when your AC should shut off versus your air conditioner. Basically, what we call an optimized home, right? So completely having IoT-based situational awareness, where your TV knows that you're not home, so it shuts off, and your refrigerator that was acting at 32 degrees shuts off because it knows your air conditioner is going to ramp up, or pre-cooling your house at 3 p.m. because you know you're going to be home at 4 and 5, and then shutting it off at 5 p.m. when energy usage is spiking. Those are going to be the things that are going to take a lot of technology, coordinated technology. So kind of, here comes blockchain, and actually change the energy makeup of how we manage our grids. And that's very exciting to me.
Right. I just drove this past weekend to Vegas. My father lives there, and there's there's solar panels outside of Prim, which I believe is the largest in the country.
Yep.
And I've watched it grow over the last 7 years, and I know there was some funding problems early on, but I believe they're back on track. And in my mind, I'm like, what's the obstacle to putting these up all over the place? I mean, there's so much desert out here, and of course you don't want to destroy ecosystems, but at the same time, it's not that much space.
Yeah, I think there's a couple obstacles. One, the utilities have a monopoly on energy in certain marketplaces, in certain markets, specifically Nevada. Two, there's a lot of political pressure to obviously save those utilities. And so every time you take power off the grid and put it in the hands of a solar farm, you do have, there's another beneficial owner that potentially is taking away market share from the utility. Another piece is the credit markets, which basically are the traditional financial markets. And the third or fourth one, the fourth one, is there's only so much solar that you can put in without being disruptive to the grid. And that's what I mentioned before around batteries and demand response. So Nevada is still a regulated market. And if you look at what happened with NV Energy and the casinos on the Strip, is they have to pay a lot of money to buy their power from those solar farms. So there's still very much a math problem associated with solar in general. Like, why don't we have 7,000 megawatts of solar in Texas? Well, developers need to buy land, acquire land, build a big enough plot of land together, basically buy the solar panels, finance them. It's very similar to building a hotel or a big commercial district. There's permitting, there's long lead times, there's financing charges. I mean, there's a lot of manual processes associated with financing and closing a power plant, right? Closing the financing of a power plant. So you have tax equity, which is a special form of equity that goes into the power plant the power plant economics. You have debt, right? That's a Wall Street thing. You have equity, which is, sponsor equity, which comes from high net worth individuals and sovereign wealth funds and family offices. You have developers who need to get paid. You have landowners who are negotiating royalties and lease payments. You have to acquire enough land to coordinate it. You have to work with the utility to basically have them connect you and build substations and make sure that the energy that's being generated is actually generated in a fair way. And then you have to find a buyer of the electricity and they have to be able to buy it out for more than 10 years because of the financing. And that buyer has to have high credit worthiness. Otherwise, you can't get a loan. And so it's a lot of moving pieces to basically build what looks like an erector set or a Lego set for solar. And that's what really it is. I mean, you're not talking about crazy infrastructure. You're not talking about building, huge boilers or supercritical steam units or giant compressors. You're literally talking about building framing, pouring concrete pillars, and lining up solar panels. That's the extent of these farms. Again, I do not want to alienate or piss anybody off by saying it's not complicated, especially the ones who develop solar plants and actually design and build them. But it's not that complicated in comparison. You can build a large-scale solar facility in 8 months. It might take 18 months or 24 months to build a natural gas facility. I think also another thing to consider is that we have a tariff here in the United States, right, which just showed up last year. And so that's increased the cost. We have expensive labor force, right? Would that increase the cost? If you look at the cost differential between Australia, the rooftop system in Australia, versus a rooftop system here in the United States, the United States rooftop systems cost anywhere between 2 and 3 times the same amount for the same technology, same roof square footage, because the United States has a lot of noise in terms of the process, right? So it's not automated, and a lot of soft costs that don't need to be there around marketing, around installers. So we don't make it easy here in the United States to put solar up. And then there's regulatory concerns, like in Florida, like in some of the other markets that potentially don't even allow you to install solar on your roof. And if you install too much, you get penalized. And so this is the reason for Swytch. Swytch understands, and kind of the whole thesis and underlying idea is that it needs to be less complicated. We need smart contracts. We need straight-through processing, streamlined data, streamlined analytics, and the other stuff is going to exist. The hardware cost and the software cost, the hardware cost and the soft cost around installation and et cetera, are going to do what they do. But let's make it more efficient on our side, and more efficient on the registration, the development, the finance, the smart contracts around when projects get financed, what the credit looks like. I mean, all of that on the financial side is potentially what's hampering the massive growth of renewables, specifically in a lot of markets in the U.S.
Are you familiar with the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh?
No, I have not. I've not heard of that.
Okay, so he's written for decades. He's fantastic, but he wrote a book 2 years ago based off of a series of lectures he gave in Chicago called The Great Derangement, which is specifically about climate change and about humans not being able to see what's happening as it's happening in front of us. I mean, another example is John McPhee wrote in the 1980s for The New Yorker an article about how New Orleans was going to go under when a big hurricane hits. Yeah. So it's not that people don't have the foresight, but Ghosh, he makes an argument that I never even considered. He looks at climate change from the perspective of Asia and South Asia, and he says that if colonialism didn't happen, Asia was on the same pace of steam technology as Europe. But then colonialism happened, and if Asia had developed as rapidly as Europe, we'd be way worse off right now. And it's not an argument for colonialism, obviously, but he does say that if that would have happened, that would be the case. And right now, you have countries like China and India who are saying, you guys got a head start. We want this power now. We're rising to it. And you're seeing this proliferation of pollution that you mentioned a little while ago. How do you combat something like that? The nations that are like, well, we don't care. We're actually making money right now, and we don't care how we get it.
Yeah, I think that I think a lot of that rhetoric is potentially going away. I think that some of the countries that have the biggest pass from the Paris Climate Accord, and a lot of the countries that are saying, hey, you guys got the benefit of industrialization and colonialization and massive growth in your economies because you're able to pollute and generate all this carbon emissions and all this stuff, and it's not fair for us. I think a lot of that's changed. A lot of the conversations that I've been in have changed or are changing, saying we're actually doing better than you guys ever thought we could do. And they've created, again, this is kind of the same idea around, these nation states not leading the way, but the cities leading the way, and you're seeing a potential for them to leapfrog. And I think never have to go and build. Now again, where the countries are still massively polluting. They're polluting the waterways. They're dumping. They're killing all the wildlife in the oceans. I mean, I'm not giving China or India a pass, but the level of technological growth and the attention to building solar and building the new technologies before they, rather than going and building old stuff. And China's a little different. China's come out and said, we're building coal, we're going to build the cheapest resource, whatever else. Solar is the cheapest resource, actually. So they're building they're going to be faster than us to get to 100% renewable than the U.S. They will be well ahead of us because they produce the cheapest panels in the world. Now, again, from a pollution perspective, who knows what they're doing to the local ecologies around lithium mines and silicon mines all over the world. But let's just put that aside for a second. We are seeing a change in the story from the developing countries to basically want to develop these new technologies almost on pace, if not faster than the U.S. That's the first thing. The second thing is I agree with the authors that you mentioned is that the human brain has a very difficult time understanding multi-generational existential or externalities. It doesn't happen. The brain is short term. It's wired for short term. It's wired for risk aversion, and it's just part of it's literally part of our biology. And so when people talk about fear of climate change, and because you can't touch it, because you can't see it, people ignore it, right? They just say, well, it's not. I can't do anything about it. It's going to happen. And I think that there's enough science out now, and there's enough technology out for prediction models or whatever else that give a good idea of what the world might look like if climate change becomes a major problem. You talk about climate migrations. You talk about desertification. You talk about loss of ecosystems. You talk about loss of life. You talk about loss of wildlife. You talk about changing currents and food food deserts. And you talk about extreme weather. Nobody wants to live in that world. I know for a fact nobody wants to live in a world where they're being pounded by hurricanes every day, or flooding is existing in the cities that never flooded before, or wildfires are raging in places that have been without wildfires for decades, and people have lived in relative what I would call climate peace. But I think from my perspective, we have to be able to tell better stories about what the world looks like, assuming that we get it wrong. And unfortunately, the fear message doesn't sell very well. It's great for eyeballs, but it doesn't sell very well when you're talking about wanting to change. And so it's got to come from a positive place. It's got to come from a place of hope, and it's got to come from a place where it actually affects everybody, and the ways that it affects everybody. And in some cases, the math actually makes more sense to be more sustainable, right? Recycled water, reclaimed water, solar, battery storage. Some of the math actually makes sense to be, to adopt these technologies over what used to be cheaper technologies. So, I think the world is rapidly changing. People are still going to do what's economically beneficial to them. But that whole idea that I mentioned earlier around cooperative game theory is how do you create games that allow for cooperation rather than competition? How can we create a cooperative model where everybody's incentivized to do the right thing? And that's what we're tasked with, at Swytch, is we're tasked with finding incentives to make that happen, adding kind of greed to the equation, and supporting new technologies that can solve that problem and solve the math problem at the same time.
Well said. Last question. How did you get involved into or engaged with the RChain ecosystem?
So I had heard of RChain well before I met the Reflective Ventures group. I had a close colleague that was basically said he was giving up his entire crypto blockchain portfolio and going all in with RChain because he believed in the technology, he believed in the approach, he believed in Meredith's story, believed in this specific technology fixing the problems of some of the other earlier blockchain experiments, I guess you can call them. And so when we met with the Reflective Ventures folks in New York,
we had a couple conversations, and they had heard of our project. Obviously, we had heard of theirs. At the time, we were really not considering moving off of kind of Ethereum because we had the smart contract libraries, and we had our our audits done, and it was the easiest way to do a token sale and all these other things. And plus, the RChain testnet hadn't launched yet. But the conversations that we had with the team and the conversations that we had around with our engineers and our technologists and the people who are developing our solution, the stories aligned. Number one, they supported our mission. And number two is the requirements and needs for highly scalable platforms that can basically run multiple computations in potentially different regions in the world, and then basically interact with what looks like high velocity IoT information from power plants, which is phase one. And then when it gets much more complicated, when we start looking at smart meters and demand response IoT devices and electric charging vehicles and batteries and what the states of batteries look like, we recognize that RChain represented a reasonable or almost the best course for us to be able to launch the nuts and bolts of what we're trying to do. Obviously, we have these like fairly large ideological goals and expectations of what we need to happen, but we have to be very practical with how it gets done. And so what I say is we do something very, very boring, which is track information and data from IoT devices that are either producing or producing or consuming energy. And we have to have a very good infrastructure around data capture, data storage, and we have to be able to do that in a scalable way. And so if you can't do that in a scalable way, then none of it matters, right? You can't create a real-time carbon ledger. You can't create real-time incentives and behavioral changes and modifications if you're only reporting it, in batch transactions once a day, or it costs you, $1,000 in gas to pull, 10 devices of information. We're talking about potentially millions of devices across the world doing, many different computations or many different interactions with either on-chain or off-chain services. It wouldn't have worked with Ethereum. And so when RChain came along on the Reflective Ventures team, we had, an immediate bond around what our mission was. And then obviously the development team was impressed and excited to be working with RChain. And we came to Berlin, and we were there for the testnet launch, and we brought our lead developer there, and Rolang and the language that RChain is developed in. He picked up immediately, wrote his first smart contract within 5 minutes, and we're off to the races. And so we're really excited about what the future holds with the RChain platform and how we can help scale the different use cases and help kind of showcase the potential for large transaction volumes and show that we're on the right network and platform that's going to get us to a scale that needs to happen for our project to be successful.